Hey everyone, welcome to the show. Super excited to have Jay Phelps on. Great conversation, great guy. If you find yourself enjoying the conversation as we go, please consider giving us a like and subscribing. It really helps out the channel. Thank you so much. And here we go. Hey everyone, ZDS 076 with Jay Phelps.
Hey!
How you doing, Jay?
Good. How are you doing, man?
Very good. So I was remembering, I don't know if you remember this, but we met in person in Las Vegas.
Yeah. Oh, I totally remember. Of course.
Dude, it was, so that was my first ever conference. And my first day, I was there early, and you came up out of nowhere and just talked to me and were like, hey. I was like, I know you.
Oh, I don't remember coming up out of nowhere and talking to you, but I do that. I do walk up to random people, and I'm like,
yeah.
Hey,
it was very impactful. You were like, you said hi, and then you asked me for my Twitter handle, and you followed me, and then we talked for like 5 more minutes, and then you went on. I was just kind of starstruck. So, but still. Sorry, I'm embarrassing you. Anyways,
okay. Thank you.
You are now the co-founder of Outsmartly, which is a company that is focused on ESR, which I believe stands for Edge Slice Rendering. Can you tell us a little bit?
Re-rendering.
Re-rendering.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. No, that's okay. It's you're believe me. Everyone does that because you're so used to hearing just rendering. But
yeah,
the whole shtick with it is that it's re-rendering.
Yeah. Well, this thing sounded like a really interesting take that kind of took in the architecture of the web, right? So when we talk about edge slice re-rendering, well, I'll let you talk about it. Let's do that instead of me.
Sure. Yeah. So. Thanks for having me on. Obviously, I'm Jay.
Yeah.
But so we're edge slice re-rendering is something that we came up with somewhat by accident, in the sense of like it's kind of an amalgamation of like the experiences of myself and some of the other folks at the company. Mm-hmm. It's no secret that I love compilers and language theory and all sorts of fun stuff like that. But I'm also been doing UI work for quite a while. I'm working on dev tools and developer experience related stuff. So. We were trying to, me and my co-founder Shimon were trying to solve this issue with being able to do dynamic content in a performant way with the modern Jamstack. Mm-hmm. And the problem comes with that is that there's basically longstanding tutors, without going too long into this, but there's two major places where people have been doing dynamic content. They either do it server side, and in which case they do server side rendering, right, or they do it client side, and in which case it's just some client side JavaScript library, usually a third party library. There's tons of examples: Optimizely, Google Optimize, you pick one. I mean, there's a bajillion companies that are doing that, and they both have pros and cons, but fundamentally, the server-side rendering one doesn't work well if you wanted to do static site generation, or if you wanted to do, even if you do server-side rendering like Remix or something like that. The whole shtick with Remix from Michael and Ryan Florence is that they're basically saying that static site generation is essentially server-side rendering where you cache it at the edge. Like there's not much of a big difference, and I subscribe to that. I agree with that to some extent. There's edge casing and cases and stuff like that. That's not entirely true, but I subscribe to that. But that doesn't solve your problem with dynamic content, because if you're caching it at the edge, you then cannot personalize it. By definition, you cannot, traditionally at least, personalize that content for a particular person. So if give you tons of simple examples, but like as an example, let's say like right now we're doing a proof of concept basically with ButcherBox, and we're going to be talking about this at GatsbyConf here in the coming weeks. And essentially what we're doing on our proof of concept, they're not doing this today, but what we're doing on our proof of concept is they have this like recipe blog where they show recipes, obviously, but so someone can go from the recipe blog, which is a very useful blog, has great recipes. Someone can go from there to butcherbox.com, but butcherbox.com doesn't realize that the recipe that person came for originally probably is the type of meat that they want. So like they might be running a promotion on that meat, and that person wouldn't even know that they were running that promotion because they might be running through 5 other different promotions. Like it could be some like lobster dish or something, and they could be running like a buy one get one free lobster thing or something like that, and the customer wouldn't know that unless they personalize the content specifically for that person. So that's an example. I mean, but there's a bajillion others. Pricing is one that's we commonly hear is just that pricing is pricing is constantly being updated, and so I can't use static site generation, and I can't use heavy caching policies because then obviously like I have to regenerate the whole page whenever that is invalid and all that stuff. And then there's tons of other examples, but for time reasons, I'll just give the example of A/B testing. If you're trying to do actual A/B testing where you wanted to like show different promotions or different images, whatever it is, all sorts of dynamic content is there's no good story around that with the modern Jamstack, with like React and caching and static site generation, all those sorts of things. So we try to figure out. Back to the client side. So client side, really the only thing you can do, practically speaking, if you're doing caching. And so the problem with that is if you've ever, you do all this effort to make your Gatsby or your Next or whatever it is, all this effort to get a really fast site, just to throw this third-party JavaScript script snippet on it with this anti-flicker script and all this stuff. Like anyone who's had to deal with this almost unanimously would agree that, like at least in our experience, that it completely slows down your site. Like all the folks at Google we talked to said they have not seen a single site who has one of these who gets under the 2-second metric. Like they have this 2-second metric for like a Moto G4 on 4G, like downloading to. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can read on that. But so, and that's just it's a technical limitation, right? Like these phones running JavaScript, it's slow. You shouldn't you don't want people to have to wait to run JavaScript client side to render an important part of your site. If it's not an important part of your site, like below the fold or something like that, by all means defer it as long as you can, and it's like whatever. But so anyway, so there has been a bunch of iterations and evolutions of the technology, but essentially we figured out that ahead of time when you build your JavaScript app, right? You're right. Like right now we're targeting React, but we're going to do Vue and all that other stuff later. But like right now you build your app, you're transpiling your components and bundling and do all that fun stuff. During that phase, we can do static analysis. And that basically is just a fancy word for we can analyze your code even without running it.
That's where your compiler knowledge comes into play, right?
Exactly, yes. And so we can figure out what we look at we have first-class knowledge in this case of what a React component looks like in the sense of like you've got these functional components and they've got props and the props then get used and you've got loops and all sorts of fun things. We could follow the data flow graph combined with information from the control flow graph. And you don't have to know what any of these terms mean, but the point is we can follow these like very interesting compiler related stuff and we can extract information out of there. And one of the things we extract out is we extract what are called code slices. So we follow the flow of data through a component and extract out the minimum amount of JavaScript needed if you were to change that prop for that component. So if you have a component that has like a message prop, or I'm doing things that are really simple, but if you have like a message prop or something, and then you call 2 uppercase on it, and then concatenate it with some other string or something, whatever it is, we extract out the minimum amount of code needed to do that if you were to change that prop. We don't know which props you might change or want to change, so we have to extract that every combination that could be possible. But the beauty of all of that is we take all that information gets shipped to the edge, and combined with some additional information that does get gathered at runtime, we're able to cache your HTML. So you're able to use static site generation or your server-side rendering, doesn't matter. We can cache your HTML at the edge and then dynamically, just in time, re-render just what's needed. So you have the conceptual mental model of, I can pick a component. So I can say, here's my hero banner component. That's the one I want to target, and I want to override the message prop of that component. And here's a new value for that prop. You don't have to provide all the props, just the new value you want. And we will figure out the minimum amount of JavaScript needed to change that and to make that change into the HTML document just in time, and then do the work of coordinating the rehydration process. Because if you don't, then it just gets blown away when the JavaScript boots up. But that's a long story of basically, you can have the mental model of, I can re-render a particular component. I can pick a component, say I'm going to re-render it, even though it doesn't actually re-render the whole thing. But you can get like, not an exaggeration, tremendously fast performance. In fact, in a majority of cases, you literally cannot tell the difference in performance. Like, you turn it on, turn it off, there's no difference in speed. And so that means you can get the same performance you'd get out of serving static content. So 30 milliseconds, like if you have a fast internet, like on my machine, I can download the entire document in 30 milliseconds, including with the personalization run and everything, which is like unheard of performance. And then that way you can get, your hundreds across the board on your Lighthouse scores and your sub 2 second
with fully dynamic content.
With fully dynamic content.
Specifically for that user. That's really cool.
Yeah, and it just takes advantage of something we realized early on is just a by and large, a vast majority of the people who want to do this sort of dynamic content, very little of the app actually changes. So the big problem we have today is that server-side rendering, which is probably the best solution short of the client-side stuff, because actually client-side is usually slower than doing it server-side rendering.
Yeah.
The problem with server-side rendering is you're just doing a bunch of work. It's death by 1,000 cuts. You have to rebuild the entire page. Some pages, maybe that's acceptable. Maybe it's a couple hundred milliseconds if you're really lucky. But some pages are going to get hundreds and hundreds of milliseconds, if not thousands of milliseconds, just to generate a page. Then you got to deal with like revalidation of your contentful models and your, all your headless stuff. And it's just a complexity that you don't necessarily need when we realize that very little of the page actually needs to change to get a lot of value out of it.
Yeah.
Now, there's certainly cases that wouldn't benefit nearly as much. You could certainly use it, and you would technically get a benefit, but you wouldn't see as drastic of a benefit. And that's like if you're doing like a dashboard or basically something where like literally the entire page is essentially dynamic minus some scaffolding. It pays the most because we don't, the magic is really just do less work, do the minimum amount of work necessary to do the dynamic content. But if your entire page needs to change, of course, you're going to do an entire page worth of work. But in practice, like as long as it's not like a dashboard or something like that, if your e-commerce stores are really the biggest people who want these sorts of things, they want to be able to do personalization and A/B tests and localization and pricing and those sorts of things. So that's the big shtick. I mean, we have other things like our baseline product also speeds up it's complicated to explain, but our baseline product actually speeds up your site. We just analyze. We have found some very common patterns within Jamstack, and we're able to find and automatically applies things that, as far as prioritization of resources and optimization of images and rewriting so they're not going on third-party domains. And like basically it's kind of like having the performance side of the product is kind of like having a full-time engineer who knows what they're doing when it comes to like performance, like, who does that for a living. And that's the only thing they do, because that's what we do. That's the whole point of what we're servicing. So
yeah, that's very cool. So like automating performance.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not like our primary claim to fame, but it is part of what we do, because it's like we're right in there anyway, and we learned that we can. We're going to even get more. That's going to get even more complex because of the static analysis. We're able to glean more information about your application that a normal optimizer would not be able to do.
Right.
But
makes sense. Hey, could I take us back a little bit, because we've talked previously on my show. We talked a lot about like this carousel that we're on when it comes to like front end development. So like it started like the world was young. It was 1995, and like servers, you push up HTML to servers. Sometimes you push like a little bit of JavaScript, like that's to make things a little dynamic, right? And then you kind of in this world, we're in like a server side world, right? Like everyone's getting stuff. The HTML comes back, script tags inside of there. Script tag says, okay, go get the script from the server, come back with it, and kind of comes in, right? And then the progression from that was we went from like 1Z, 2Z JavaScript files to fully fledged JavaScript frameworks that end up being like really cool evolution for the web, because it made your browser like a app store almost.
It did.
Yeah,
it's a virtual machine, an operating system, essentially. I mean, a virtual operating system. It's been beautiful.
Yeah, that's so cool. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. Go ahead.
No, not at all. Not at all. You didn't interrupt me at all. Yeah, I was just saying. I just said accidentally, in the sense of like, obviously the web wasn't originally as a document server. No one, I don't think anyone, no matter who you are, I don't think anyone predicted that the web would be as it is today, as prolific and stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's interesting because it's like there's been nudges, it's well-known nudges to move that even further, but have not had as much success, like Chrome OS and Firefox OS and Palm OS and all these like, well, the web is essentially an operating system, so why not just make the whole operating system the web? And they've not, Chrome OS I think has had them. Chrome OS has, I mean, objectively speaking, Chrome OS has had great success. But it's somewhat of a cheat in the sense of like they've, a majority of their success, from my understanding, I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is the majority of their success comes from schools. Bulk
My
sales.
kids all got Chromebooks when things went crazy.
Which, I mean, success is success. So I'm not trying to discredit it per se, but I'm just saying that like, I don't know any friends who are using Chromebook, other than their kids. I know some kids that are, but so when I say like, it hasn't been prolific, I just mean that like, it's I've checked in on Chrome OS every couple of years just to see, and getting closer. But there's just still, gaps.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I could go into a whole tirade about how our local school district decided that the best thing for my kindergartner was to give him a Chromebook.
Oh, you don't disagree? You disagree?
No. I mean, like,
I have no idea because I haven't. I've only used them in the sense of like, I had a friend. I won't say his name, but everyone probably knows who I'm talking about. Who worked at Google for a while, and he was given a Chromebook. He was like from work, and he's like, I don't know, like whatever. So like we played with it or whatever, and it's cool. I mean, it's Chrome. And this was right around the time where they had like the Linux subsystem or whatever, which is cool too, like being able to run Android apps or something like that, it's nice. But then at the same time, you're just like, well, isn't that just running Linux then? And like with like a weird shell UI on top of it. And I don't know.
Yeah. No, I wasn't really poking at that at all. I was just more poking at they saddled my 5-year-old with a laptop and were like, okay, kid.
Wow, 5 years old.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it was kind of crazy. So we've got a lot of kids, Jay. We got 6 kids.
Okay,
and when COVID hit, we were like, okay, we're gonna make it through. Like, bugger on, But it ended up with like my wife we set up a room as like our school room. It was just like managing children going from like Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting for 5-year-olds. It was like, it was weird. And
did they master it?
What's that?
Did they master Zoom? Like, are they the masters of Zoom now? Oh,
no, I don't want them to be masters of Zoom. Not yet. Okay. So we actually pulled them out and put them into like homeschooling after 1 week of that.
Oh, wow.
But that's the whole thing there. But sorry, I'm completely
probably efficient at that point.
Yeah. Well, so I've been listening to. I was just listening to a talk from you. I didn't get all the way through it, but I tried to prep for us. Listening to a talk on WebAssembly, which is kind of like taking that idea further. And there's all these things, I think, that like pushing the web to be in like this playground app store that I want it to be, but it still feels like chained down by its legacy of being like the document viewer. I think one of the Remix guys, I think it was Ryan, was talking about how browser is at its core the document viewer, and I don't know. I think web apps demand more respect than that these days. So I don't know.
It depends. I mean, there's extremes both ways, right? Like the one of the big, from my perspective. So I have a lot of experience also with on the native side of things, and it's like that whole tool chain got a big like. That whole community of tool chains kind of got a big, wake up call, I guess, when WebAssembly came out, in the sense of like people were like, oh, it sounds like such a good idea. And then they quickly realized that like none of that tooling had the web in mind at all. Like file sizes and dynamic libraries and like, all sorts of things that like a native person takes for granted that the web does not. And, there's still some of those problems have been tremendously like, I've been surprised at how quickly they've been solved. Mscripting is a great example of something that's just like been phenomenal for that sort of thing. But there's still
what was that? You said that was phenomenal?
Mscripting.
Mscripting.
Yeah, it's essentially Clang, if you're a C or C++ person or Objective-C or what have you, it's like Clang, but designed for the web. It's
Okay.
like the goal of it. I haven't checked in the last year or so, like as far as like the implementation details, but the goal of it is eventually to be just a light wrapper around Clang. What's
Yeah.
LLVM and all these are things that are not in the web. Web people are like, I don't know what LLVM is, like, because you have no reason to know. It's all native related things.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
once those tooling, once the native side of things caught up more, the goal was for Emscripten to mostly be just kind of like a polyfill for the web, just to excuse me, to some extent, like a runtime. So like,
Yeah.
if you are writing a C or C++, like maybe someone took a course, or maybe you've done some C++. Not you, I just mean the person listening or whatever. But like if you've heard of pthreads, like the way to do like just spawn threads and stuff like that, like there has to be an implementation for pthreads. Like how does a pthread actually work? And so if you want to use a pthread on the on the web, you have to have that has to get bolted on to the underlying infrastructure of how a pthread would work.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the
Well, the
case of the
child
web,
process API in Node, like you can't use that in the web, right? The
exactly.
same idea.
Yeah, same idea. So in the case of like Emscripten, it abstracts away like web workers and shared array buffer and atomics and all this stuff that gets
Yeah.
exposed, but abstracts it in a way that
Mhm.
will just work out of box with the pthread abstraction from C++.
Yeah. 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 So I'm no compiler expert, Jay. So maybe have some patience with me. But my understanding is like there's this native code we want to use in the web, right? And there's pieces of it that take advantage of things like pthreads and so forth. If you use a compiler like Clang, that is taking your C code, compiling it down to machine code into binaries for you to run natively. The browser is purposely sandboxed, so we don't have access to you don't have access to that just through the browser. So we need a compiler like Emscripten we could take potentially the same native code. So the source code would remain the same, but it's compiled in a way that is WebAssembly friendly. Am I close?
It's hard to know what level of detail to explain and what not to explain, because it's easy
Sure.
to get because there's a lot of things that happen. But the
Yeah.
high level, that sounds, pretty close. So WebAssembly is analogous. Think of WebAssembly as the same thing as x64 or x86 or ARM. Like it's really close to the same idea. Like there's some big fundamental differences. Anyone listening is probably like, people who know are probably like, no,
So
it's not.
yeah. So these are like machine code, right?
Exactly. It's machine code. Now, the biggest difference is that like x86 and ARM and stuff are designed for a physical processor, whereas WebAssembly is designed for a virtual processor, in the sense of there is, at least as of now, no physical processor that runs WebAssembly natively. It's assumed that you'll run it in a virtual machine. There's no actual intrinsic reason why you have to do that. Someone can and probably will eventually make a WebAssembly processor, whether that's practical or not. Someone probably will. Just like how there are Java, like little nugget of unknown things. So SIM cards for your like AT&T phones or whatever, those run Java. They run a very limited subset of Java bytecode, which is ridiculous, but
that's
they do.
Crazy. JVM is everywhere.
JVM is everywhere, right? Exactly. So,
even on your SIM cards.
Even on your SIM cards, not a full-fledged or anything, and they don't have like the standard library or anything. So it's like, the reality is way less impressive, is what it sounds. But the idea is the same. It's a bytecode. It's a machine code bytecode, and the purpose being so like where like that. So that's the target. That's the and Clang today can actually target WebAssembly directly, even without Emscripten. The problem is that Clang doesn't have any of that runtime library information. Like it doesn't have any way to bolt on that pthread. It doesn't have a standard library for WebAssembly and the web and WASI and all these other terms and things that are related to WebAssembly. It just knows how to compile, because Clang is built on top of a library called LLVM. And that library has the ability to target WebAssembly. It just doesn't have knowledge of all the rest of this stuff. And that's where Emscripten comes in. It's like it wraps all of that infrastructure and then provides additional stuff that's very specific for targeting the web, so that you can just, in some cases, not every case, but in a lot of cases, you can just basically switch Clang for Emscripten, maybe change a couple headers here and there, and then compile it, boom, for the web. That's like best case scenario. There's certain when you're writing a native app, sometimes people write things that are very platform specific, or you're using a library that's platform specific. Like as soon as you write any assembly code, like inline assembly, you're screwed because that's platform specific. Like
Right.
to the or if you're using you couldn't take an iOS app and compile it to the web as is, because iOS uses UIKit, right? Which is like this whole library that's specific to iOS, and that doesn't exist on the web. So even if you can compile, like Swift, there is an effort to have Swift be able to compile to WebAssembly, and it works today. Whether it's practical is a different story, but it does work today. But that doesn't mean that you can use Cocoa on the web. That doesn't mean you can use UIKit on the web or Swift UI. Someday maybe, but the language and the libraries are not the same thing, and that's something that's kind of difficult to grok. All this stuff, just in case this intimidates anyone, whenever I'm talking about this stuff, some people get intimidated. It's like very little of this is actually difficult. It's just like the web. Like people who don't do CSS and they don't do JavaScript and they don't do these bundler things, that stuff's intimidating to them too, even if they don't admit it, because guess what? It's just knowledge you don't have. It's not that it's intrinsically difficult. It's not like writing native apps requires math skills any more than writing a JavaScript app does, unless it's a math related something to do with.
I haven't gotten my hands dirty in any kind of WebAssembly stuff. It sounds really cool, but just maybe like some curiosity on like the fringes of it. Like, is JavaScript still used to bootstrap WebAssembly? Is JavaScript used like as a controller to send events to WebAssembly? I imagine it must, right?
So right now, So
okay.
Right, there's the story right now, and then there's the future. So right now, WebAssembly as it is, as a language, is designed intentionally to be not actually specific to the web. There's actually a joke in the inner community that WebAssembly is neither for the web nor is an assembly language. Like it actually isn't specifically just for the web, and it isn't actually an assembly language, but because it's a bytecode. But that's the irony of naming things. But so the spec itself goes to great pains to not be web specific. The benefit of that is that it can get popular and get used elsewhere, because everyone involved saw the potential. There's never been a standardized bytecode made, period.
Oh, wow.
No one has ever made a standard, like a community standardized.
So this goes beyond the web. This is like a code unification goal, like in general. Is that too far?
it's like there's I'll just give examples. So there's the JVM and there's the CLR. JVM's for Java and all the other languages that target the JVM, like
Kotlin,
Groovy, et cetera, Scala. There's the CLR, which is Microsoft's, like for the .NET runtime, and all their languages that target them. And then there's a whole plethora of other like long tail of virtual machines.
Yeah, well, each of these are like very impactful by themselves, like true innovation. Like you said, these things are running on our SIM cards. Like they're ubiquitous to programming to much of 90s to 2000s to 2010s technology. So really cool stuff. But now is this like the next evolution on top of that? Similar idea, virtual machines?
Yeah, similar idea, just aiming to be more generic. And there's good things and bad things that come from that. This WebAssembly will probably never, it's hard to say, but it probably will never kill the CLR. It'll probably never kill the JVM and those sorts of things, because those customized virtual machines can do things that are very, like the JVM. There's a reason why languages that get designed for the JVM actually have some traits intrinsically that are stuck with like Java, like Scala is a great example of like there are oddities of Scala that come from the fact that it runs on the JVM. Not because they intentionally wanted something to be like that, but because it runs on the JVM. So there's only so much you can do without. It's Turing complete, so you can do anything, but there's only so much you can do without having interop issues and performance, degrading and stuff like that. So if you're going to target the JVM, you might as well embrace the JVM's conventions. And the JVM's design was originally at least designed to run Java, right? So. But there's optimizations that JVM has a JIT compiler. It just-in-time compilation. It can learn the patterns of code and optimize things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas WebAssembly is designed to be much lower level. It's still a virtual machine, but it's like in between JVM and assembly and like actual machine code, like in the sense of abstraction. It's lower level. It doesn't currently, at least, have the concept of an object or even a struct. It's just a linear memory, and you can load and store from that linear memory, and you just got numbers. And then everything else is a convention on top of that, that the language has to have some sort of convention. Whereas the JVM everything has to be a class. In fact, there's no naked functions or something like that. And so it's kind of the opposite, is where there's a lot of abstraction in the JVM. That's the original version of WebAssembly and the original goal. I mean, there's evolutions. There's been a long-standing effort to add native garbage collection and some sort of concept of a garbage collected thing, a record, if you want to call that an object. Some people don't like to call those things objects, but some sort of garbage collected record. It's kind of gotten stagnated, though. I mean, just because there is that underlying desire to make WebAssembly work with everything. Like, wouldn't it be great if Java could target it and be fast? And wouldn't it be great if C# could also target it and be fast? And would it be great if C++ could target it and be fast? And then also Swift, and then also Python, and then it's just it keeps going and going and going. And wouldn't it be great to have one bytecode that rules them all? And it's somewhat impractical because you have to draw the line, but it's not really, though, in the sense of just because it's not going to be the best thing, it doesn't mean it won't still see a lot of use. As an example, if every machine had a WebAssembly virtual machine, that would mean you didn't, and if .NET related stuff could target that would mean you wouldn't necessarily have to install the CLR to run those apps and those commands and those libraries and those other things, which is very powerful to not have to install a virtual machine because something already came with it. Or like the browser as an example. It's very powerful
in the browser.
Sending an entire virtual machine to the browser is very impractical. And so having something there, as the browser being just one of many examples, it's very powerful. And then honestly, WebAssembly has gotten the most use outside of the web at this point, which is somewhat ironic, right? So the cryptocurrency things and server side and IoT and all this stuff, because there was a lot of use case for running I'd say one of the biggest parts of it is it's sandboxed, intrinsically sandboxed. So you can run, if you have a WebAssembly virtual machine that is written well, in the sense of has good security and all that stuff, theoretically, it's perfectly secure, and you can run any insecure content. You can run arbitrary code in there, and it will only be able to it can only speak to the outside world of what you let it do it. So obviously, if you let it do things that are naughty, it will be able to do things that are naughty. But having that sandbox is a very powerful thing. And there's companies like Wasmer, Wasmer.io, that has that's their whole shtick is creating a virtual machine for WebAssembly that other apps can then embed into theirs. So they have bindings for C++, bindings for Python, bindings for Ruby, bindings for all these sorts of things. And then just take Wasmer out of the game for a second and just talk about WebAssembly in general. That I'll give you a great example. Shopify. They're using, I can't remember which virtual machine they ended up going with, but they're using WebAssembly to run customer arbitrary code, to customize their internal API related things. Because that's what they wanted to do. And you could do, containers somewhat solve this, but really containers are not the best abstraction because they're slow to start up. They're resource intensive, relatively speaking, especially if all the thing you want to do is just run a little function. All I want to do is run a function. I don't need a file system. I don't need an operating system and all this other stuff. So WebAssembly is a good abstraction.
That's really neat, actually. So Shopify is super interesting to me architecturally, just because it's kind of there's the central entity, but then it's the engine by which all these independent shops run their stores, right? So being able to customize their shop to run their own logic, even that's a really interesting application of WebAssembly. It seems like that's very cool.
And there's Fastly's Terrarium project where you can run WebAssembly at the edge, and you can do that in Cloudflare workers as well. Running WebAssembly and stuff like that. But it's still, by and large, WebAssembly is still, in the grand scheme of the web, it's still fairly niche. It's for quite a while, we're probably going to see where people use WebAssembly in certain things, like tooling. For right now, if you're using Webpack and all these other things, chances are actually good that you are using WebAssembly without realizing it during your build process. Not necessarily in your production app, but the source pack or the source map library, for example, uses WebAssembly. And so if you have anything that does anything with source maps, it's relying on WebAssembly so that it would speed up your build process without needing a native Node executable. And there is a push from a lot of Node.js native bindings to move to WebAssembly for that same reason. Because like, if you ever installed an npm dependency and it's like building, it gives you a bunch of C++ crap and it takes forever because it has to, or
that JYP or the PIP, that's like Python, or what's JIP for?
That's for C++. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. So like those sort of things, like there's
that's just a post-install process.
Being run. Okay. And there's security issues with those, and they have to be built for the specific platform, and they take longer, and they're more error prone. So like WebAssembly is a good savior in that respect to some extent. There's still ways to go, and there's, like I said, the benefit and the negative of WebAssembly is that it's just a sandbox that can do hardly anything. It can just run code. So you need to give it, like, you can't even, there's no log. There's no concept of like printing to a log. You need to give it some way to print to a log. Now, there is an effort called WASI, WebAssembly System Interface, to expose a standardized set of it's essentially kind of like how Unix did that. Not the same, because Unix encompasses a whole bunch of other things, but there's some fundamental parts to Unix on the C library side and system calls and stuff like that, where it's like, here's a standard you can abide by, and then how it actually is implemented under the hood, who cares? The operating system takes care of bolting those things on, and that's what WASI is somewhat trying to solve for the WebAssembly thing. So that in theory, you could basically compile something to WebAssembly using WASI bindings, and then run that same binary on the web, or run it on Node, or run it in whatever WebAssembly sandbox. That's kind of the long and short of the goal. I think there will be, as we get further and we get some more things, I think there will be a better renaissance of languages designed for the web. That's what I'm kind of the most looking forward to as a person who likes language design and sort of things. Because like, Reason, which I think is now called Rescript, Elm, Dart, those sorts of things. I think we'll see more of those, and ones that, so like right now, all of those languages, they're either too dissimilar to JavaScript, or they're similar, but they don't really give you something. They don't give you enough to justify the effort. Well, what you lose, like the that's why TypeScript has kind of more rocketed in popularity. As there's great escape hatches. There's at the end, there's any is probably one of the best. Any is probably one of the best escape hatches ever, right? Because it's just like at the end of the day, any, who cares? YOLO.
There you go.
And you can't discredit new languages. The thing that kills a new language more faster than anything is just not having libraries, right?
Yeah.
Who wants to implement another virtual scrolling list or virtual table or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So
is Blazor
has gotten better at that. What's that?
Sorry. Yeah. The C# library Blazor, is this in that category too? Same
sort of. That's taking C# and some of those other things and kind of giving you a UI framework to let you target WebAssembly.
Okay.
It has a promise, but I think it's more in my mind. A couple things. One, I'm not an authority on Blazor because I've never actually written it with an app. I've done the Hello Worlds and I've listened to talks and stuff like that, but I've never actually written a whole app in it.
Okay.
So I can't. Some of the things I might say might be out of date or inaccurate or whatever, because it's kind of a game of telephone. But to me, do you remember GWT? I don't know if you ever got exposure to that. But this
web tokens, yeah.
No, not JWT.
Oh, GWT. Sorry.
That was the I believe that's what it was called. GWT. The Java Google Web Toolkit.
Okay.
It allows you to write and maintain JavaScript front-end applications in Java. Yeah. So that had its heyday several years ago. I'm sure it's actually still used and probably maintained. But I put the Blazor personally put the Blazor in the same box in the sense of it's somewhat niche. Like, if you were a team who's like, I don't know any languages whatsoever. I don't know any programming language whatsoever, but I want to build an app.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say you should use Blazor. Like, you should learn C# and you should, it's kind of like going against the grain. If you want to build a web app, learn technologies that are designed that were made originally for the web, not like shoehorned into the web sort of thing. But
if you are, sorry, you're going to the same place.
I think I was going to say exactly what you were going to say, which is that if you have that knowledge, that can be hugely like beneficial. I know Google used the Google Web Tool, came out of stuff that they built internally for that reason alone, and that can be very powerful to be able to utilize your existing experience and stuff like that. So I love it. I just think it'll always remain somewhat of a niche. But maybe that's not the case. I mean, I could be totally wrong. That may be it's somewhat coming from ignorance.
Yeah. Well, that's your impression, and that's so cool.
Yeah. Right.
But cool. In general, it's really cool to have these conversations because I feel like, I get caught up in my own world. I'm like, I really like Angular and TypeScript. I'm on this like mission this month and next month to try to get to know React fairly well, at least as well as you can learn it in 2 months. But
What did you use before Angular?
What's that?
Or did you use anything before Angular, or was Angular your first one?
So I started my career a bit later in life, around 2006. 2016.
Later in life? That's like
2016. Sorry,
2016. I was like 2006. I was like, yeah, that's a long time ago.
I'm a grandfather, Jay. I don't know if you know that, but I may be older than I look.
Yeah, probably, because I have no idea how. Yeah.
Anyways, so I got Angular's like the first thing I really got into. Before that, I was doing IVRs. So those are like the telephone systems you call into when you're like trying to call your energy company or something like that. The automated system. Yeah. So that was actually kind of a. Oh yeah, sorry.
You were enabling the pain.
I hated myself too. If it makes you feel better, but it was like the first thing out of college that I did know a lot of stuff. Anyways, it was interesting architecturally too, because I had taken all these courses in college about finite automatas and thought it was kind of interesting. It turns out IVRs are pretty much that. It's like just a state machine. And kind of interesting to think about things that way and like develop tool chains around that. But eventually we needed like someone to do web apps. And I was like, me. That's how I got into Angular. Like right as Angular 2 came out. So that's kind of my history into it.
Good timing.
Yeah, very good timing.
Learn and invest in Angular 1. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember like thinking, should I learn Angular 1? And someone told me, nah, you'll never use it. Like Angular 2's gonna like take over everything, and you'll never need to learn AngularJS. And now I'm at Narwhal, and most of my time is converting AngularJS apps to Angular, and I wish I knew it.
So, the irony! Yeah,
I know. I could have just like learned it then. I don't know. That's probably not a trivial thing, but. Like I love it. Like there's so much about it, especially when you combine it with RxJS. I feel like I watched your talk. You had a talk from I think it was September 2016. I think you gave it to Netflix. You're talking about RxJS, React, and Redux. And there's this comparison of code that you did in this talk that was like exactly what I've done in like every presentation I've given on this, which is showing here's an imperative way of doing this example. And it's not even that complex. Like the imperative examples maybe like 100 lines. So in the stuff I've looked at, it's not that weird to get like 2,000 line like chonkers, that are just like huge things of imperative code. That's like, dealing with those. It's like I sit down with pen and paper and like draw this convoluted map of all the different ways things are getting set. And then I show, okay, this is RxJS. And it's like the same exact thing in like 10 lines. And it's very powerful for that.
Yeah. The problem is that investment in your head and in the paradigm. It's just so, and that's the hardest thing about RxJS is people constantly ask. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, like, "Oh, should I be using RxJS and should I learn and all stuff?" And it's like such a hard thing because it's like I can't tell you how many. Like, it's like I used to say yes almost always, and then for like a year when I did this company called This with Tracy, like basically all I did for an entire year was save people from the mistakes of that. Like in the sense of like. I saw lots of code bases where it's like people are like being told on Twitter, you need to use TypeScript, you need to use NGRX effects, and you need to use Angular, and you need to learn all these things all at once. And RxJS, of course, because it comes along for the ride. And it's like, and the person's like, I've never even written JavaScript before. And it's like trying to learn all of these things at once. It's not that they're all by themselves. It's not that it's like rocket science and you don't have the ability to do it. It's just that the point I'm trying to make is that your goal when you set out to do this was to be productive, was to actually write and get something into production. And bringing in all these things, you will never write. I mean, it's fun to learn, but I can tell you without a doubt, the first app you write using all of those things will be just a garbage dumpster fire. Like it will have so many. I mean, I probably shouldn't be that generalist, but I just see it so often that it's like, and I was the same way, believe me. It's like, that's the whole point, is that you learn, right? You make mistakes, you learn, if you don't have someone holding your hand on a pattern, you're going to come up with one, right? Yeah. How do you know that it has these edge cases and all these things? You learn from experience, right? We all write bugs, we all write bad code, you learn, evolve and stuff like that. But if you only take on one new technology, you've limited you have more time to invest in it, more time to make better decisions, more time to go back and fix tech debt. But if you're pulling in immutable JS, you've never done immutability before, so you pull in immutable JS, and you've never used TypeScript, and you've never used Args, and you never use, all these things.
This is hitting very close to home, Jay.
Is it? Okay, yeah. Narwhal probably, has probably seen similar things where it's like, they set out with this too. Oh, you did too. I did too. I mean, I believe me, we set out with the best intentions. It's not that these people aren't good engineers. It's not. I mean, some of them aren't good engineers, but I would just say that that's not what my point is. That shouldn't be the takeaway. The takeaway is that you set out with good intentions, but if you try and bite off too many things at once while you're trying to do a greenfield project, you're not going to do anything good. So slowly bring in things. Immutability is great. Learn immutability. Don't learn immutability while you're also learning RxJS. Those sorts of things is my general shtick. But
No, so my first app. This is something I've thought about a lot. Just because it's like kind of reliving the glory days, telling old war stories. But my first app was like we needed something for this client. We were way behind. They essentially needed something to manage their config, but they really needed it as sort of like a shopping cart where you'd add changes to your cart and then later on commit them all at once. And so it was a really cool first project to get into if you're getting new into web development. And it was all internal, so a lot of the things that I didn't know, I didn't need to know, accessibility stuff was, I'm sure, not perfect in this project. But
I'm awful at that.
That's the whole thing. I was talking to this with Kent C. Dodds 2 weeks ago when he was on the show, and it's just accessibility. And I think this is kind of this propagation of what we were talking before with the browser being a document sharing tool. The accessibilities are built with that in mind, and it's this knowledge now that every single developer on your team kind of needs to know, which is kind of the steep thing. When I think about my apps, I want to systemize a feature or a thing. I don't know, your state management. I'd like to systematize that so it's this layer, and then it would be nice if I could just say, okay, let's take accessibility. We'll run a vertical layer of this, and like a bus, things can come in and accessibility size themselves or something like that. There's no good solution. Maybe one day, with AI, there will be a good solution for that. But
AI would just save us.
Yeah. Please, AI.
Honestly, I mean, I keep saying impressive things. So maybe.
No, I'm very grateful for that, because it seems like it's actually a tool that AI could be very good for. Just in terms of images and the alt tag that you're supposed to put on. So just figuring some of that out. And we're go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm interrupting you. I was just excited. I had never thought about that. You gave me the idea that why doesn't the browser just not need alt tags? Why doesn't it just use machine learning? And why isn't Chrome doing that? I mean,
with like AI on your phone where he's using what, like TensorFlow. That was like the whole Google Connect thing or something like that recently, I think.
Yeah.
Give me accessibility. Like
Yeah, that's
something that would
exciting.
be like a true screen reader, like some intelligence to read a screen so that it could like backfill. I don't know whatever you had to do, or just throw whatever accessibility stack we have out and figure out something better. Um,
Right.
I don't know.
That,
Anyways, this is something like if you're a native, this is not something you need to learn. Like you can develop an app and you can kind of go on your merry way and do that. And I don't want to come
that
off
makes
like
sense.
I'm saying like accessibility shouldn't be something we focus on, because it 100% should. I had this thing in college, like our capstone project was talking to this guy. He sailed across a blind person sailed across the Atlantic Ocean completely by himself on a boat, and like was able to do that. He can't get information off the internet. He just needs to know like when the store their open times, and that's terrible. Like it's an awful problem. I just think we're solving it the wrong way. I don't
Hmm.
know. Does
Sure.
that make sense?
No, it does, and it's exciting. I wouldn't be surprised if people have done things to move us in that direction, but I haven't heard of any, and so that's very exciting to hear. There's a lot of ideas that can come with that. That's just I like two. It's a combination of two things that I am not an expert in at all, like machine learning and accessibility. I mean, I know like I have no more than scratching the surface, but it's not my forte. That's for sure.
Right.
Um,
Where were we going with this? I'm
I don't
sorry. I
know, but
went.
I like tangents. I don't know. I'm a tangent person. Like I like letting the conversations
Yeah.
just flow.
So if you see me writing, like part of me is trying to track our tangents, and I've got a very beautiful tree right now.
Okay.
So it's very cool. But I lost the one where I leap board into accessibility somehow. I forgot what we were talking about before that. Systematizing things. Um, I don't know.
Angular.
Angular. My first project. Okay, that's where we were going. Yes. So like uh, so project was behind schedule, shopping cart pat. We went all over
Yes.
that. We need to get it out quick, and I didn't know Angular. I was just like, I grabbed. I'm forgetting his name. Uh, Hussein.
Jaffer.
Jay. Yes,
Jaffer.
Jaffer's.
Mm-hmm.
No, was it Jaffer?
Jaffer Hussein worked at Netflix. No.
No, I don't think so.
Hmm.
Sorry, it's another one. Jay
Another
Walker.
Hussein. Okay. Well,
Jay?
I'm sure there are a
Is
lot of
that?
Husseins out there.
Yeah. Uh,
Trying to look up who it might
maybe
be.
I've got the name wrong.
Oh, maybe you. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of Husseins. I don't. Jaffer is the
Yeah.
only one that comes to mind off the top, and I just looked. And I didn't see. I can't think of anyone else.
Yeah. I'll put his name in the comments underneath if I remember it. But I was going through his like introduction to Angular course, and
Oh,
like
okay.
just like cramming. It was like the Matrix thing, trying to cram that knowledge in and get this thing out. And we did go into state management in this course, and Angular's kind of like, I feel like Angular is purposely just kind of leaves that whole thing alone in terms of their docs. At least at the time they did. And so
Mhm.
I was like, well, I don't know anything about the web platform, but this local storage API looks great. Hey, I can synchronize stuff across window tabs. This is awesome.
Huh?
And then I was just like, okay, local storage is my state management system now, and I like worked reasonably well. The like you said, like my code was a garbage, like was a giant garbage fire, but like the app worked reasonably well. I was proud of it. I wasn't proud. If you looked under the covers, it would be awful. And
Good.
unfortunately, I've left, and my good friend James is now like maintaining this code. I feel so bad for him. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was I to this day I remain impressed at how quick I was able to get that out with
Mhm.
bad code practices. And there is I'm going to be like purposefully more productive, and I feel like I have my workflow right now. My quality is very high, but my velocity is not.
Hmm.
And I feel like I straight traded those in some
Mhm.
ways over the years. I was just like, being at Narwhal, I do a lot of consulting. There's a lot of pressure to be doing things the right way. Maybe not as much pressure as to get things done quickly. So,
Right. Yeah,
yeah.
and I see that there's a I don't know if this is if you can relate to this at all, but I see a common. I've talked to a number of people at conferences and stuff. I see a common thing that people think that if you go to these big companies, you go to Google, you go to Netflix, you go to Microsoft or something like that, that you're going to see a code base that's just like
pristine.
like
I've seen that open source.
well, no, that's part of what I was going to say is I was going to go
Yeah.
towards the open source. So the irony being is that open source, and they think of that for a couple of different reasons. One, because it's the companies, right? But also, open source actually gives you a incorrect perception. A lot of open source is very written well, and is documented and has tests. Now you can certainly find lots of open source that isn't, but I'm just saying that like,
Well,
as
it
an,
needs
as,
to
an,
be, right?
as an example, if you look at React and you're like, oh wow, look at all the tests and look at all the documentation and look at all this. This is great. I bet working at Facebook's amazing. It's like you go into these companies, and it's not that I'm not trying to bash on Facebook. I'm just saying that like there are some things that are incredible at these companies, and you should worship those sorts of things. But I'm just saying that you shouldn't have the picture that they're all rosy, because like you're saying, a lot of times shipping is the most important thing, not necessarily doing it right. It's getting it done, getting it out there, and then learning from your mistakes. Whereas open source, there's a lot more pressure on doing it right and having tests and having like documentation and all these other things, and where you can just get away. Because it's like, it's always funny how I like some of the people I know who work on open source will do that. Will like I can't tell you how many times I've had jokes with engineers who are like, the only tests I ever write are open source tests. I don't ever write any tests internally. Like, I mean, not that I'm saying you should do that. You should write tests, but I'm just saying that like, and that's been my experience as well, in the sense of like, I've written way more tests in the open source world than I have in an application world. Not that I write tests, but I just mean that like, it's a different thing. And part of that is open source is usually on my own time. It's like, I'm not pressured. There's no deadline. Usually it's like, I can, and it's like something where I'll like, there's a weekend and I'll go in and just like, shape these things. I mean, lately I haven't done any open source. I've just been too focused on other things. But I'm saying back in the day when I was doing it, it's just this thing, this sculpture that you're just constantly sculpting. Whereas like your job is like, get it done, ship the thing, work on the next thing. But anyway, interesting observation that I agree with, I guess is what my point is.
Very cool. Well, just going back to that, that's really where I wanted to get to, is like, like sometimes you can get something done and it's a garbage fire, and that's kind of okay. So, I don't know. Anyways, taking us all the way back to like the carousel thing we were talking about, because we went into like the web as like the web or the app store, and then we went to WASM and all this other cool stuff. But we were tracking like the progression of like the evolution of just HTML and JavaScript being shipped to a browser. So moving from so we went into this really cool world where the web kind of exploded and things were apps, and it was cool. But then Lighthouse came and it told us we were bad. And not that Lighthouse came in and told us that we were bad. I think there's legitimate studies around like the metrics, like time to interactive and to first contentful page, that really mean a lot, especially to places with, like we were talking about cell phone connections, that kind of stuff. That could really like ruin engagements and make it so your app is just completely useless in those scenarios. So there's this move to server-side rendering, which was kind of just like a step backwards, no? So it's saying like, well, instead of just like shipping everything out to the browser and letting the browser do it, when we get that initial request for this website, let's give them like some initial stuff to show first. And then we can fill in back stuff. I don't know. Maybe we don't backfill in the JavaScript afterwards. So maybe we just leave it like that. And that works reasonably well. But so that's server-side rendering. Static site generation, is that a step up, or is that an enhancement to server-side rendering? How would you classify it, Jay?
So static site generation is essentially doing all of the work ahead of time, so that then you just have HTML files that you could serve on any or
Yeah.
be on S3 if you wanted to.
Yeah. So like at build time, you're building any possible any set of possible HTML. Just
Yeah.
doing that. When it comes into the CDN, it's already cached essentially. So it's just like a constant time lookup. Here's HTML. All it takes is the time for that HTML to come over the wire, essentially, and you're set. Which sounds great until you get to like the dynamic content. If you have truly dynamic content, there's no set of static site generation. You're making as many of these as possible. If it's purely dynamic, like coming from some content management system, a CMS, there's no way to build all of those ahead of time. And so I think this is where you're coming in with your ESR, which seems really, really cool to me. So, and a lot of this is just me trying to parse, what you said at the beginning, and also I'll put in the comments down below. You had your talk at the Next.js conf, so that's kind of where I got my knowledge from.
Yeah, that talk, and then I'm giving basically the same talk but spun for Gatsby, but then also with a different. We're using ButcherBox. We're partnering with ButcherBox for the demo or whatever.
That's awesome. I love that view you had with the four phones going at the same time. I felt like that was like such a cool visual to put on this. So
it's funny that you say that, because it's one of the things that we learned from that talk is that, so I don't know if you recall this, but there's the four, and the far left one is the baseline, which is basically just the app served.
That's what I do.
Now, the problem we found is that ironically, remember I always said that Outsmartly also speeds up your site. Mm-hmm. So the problem we had is we didn't explain that during the talk, and even if we did, it probably would have still confused people. But people saw that timeline that and they got confused, because we said that the baseline is slower than using Outsmartly with ESR. Like ESR was actually even faster than the baseline, which didn't make any sense, because it's like, why you're doing dynamic content and it's faster? That doesn't make any sense. And that's because we're doing, even if you remove the ESR, it still would be faster, because there were things that were optimization do that automatically. Like, so we took the same app, code didn't change. It gets optimized automatically. And then we also do ESR, which doesn't impact the performance in most cases.
Are you going to do 5 screens next time then? One to show like just your optimization, and then another your optimization plus ESR?
Right. In this next talk, at least as of now, we're recording the talk here Tuesday. We have to re-record it. But the plan as of now is to just show the baseline being basically which is basically the same as ESR or as Outsmartly without ESR. So basically it will be the same. It'll be like the baseline and with ESR are identical. I mean, assuming the demo actually ends up being identical. We're not going to lie. If it really is identical, it'll be the same number. And because we could show the one without Outsmartly, but then we just found that people get confused. Like, they're like, I don't understand, why is the baseline slower than, it is a very confusing thing to have to explain. So, and the talk isn't about the performance optimizations we do, it's about ESR. So we can gloss over that benefit, because you muddy the message if people are confused about, like, because it looks like a typo or something. You're like,
that makes sense. Well, so let me see if I can sum up the ESR thing because I was looking into your presentation on like the slices and the overrides, and you've talked about those a little bit here too. Yeah. But so like the idea is via the compilers, it's able to analyze our code, and so static site generation, you're putting like the whole index HTML or whatever page it is, throwing it into the cache, into the CMS. Is the idea for slices, you rather than having the whole file, you say, here's this file, this is always static. So if it's like in 3 parts, a website in 3 parts, static, dynamic, static. So you grab the 2 static pieces, and then request comes in, and you run whatever your override is to determine that dynamic slice, piece it all together, send it over. Is that
sort of right? That more describes something more like ESI, edge side includes or something, I think is what they call it. It's that what you're describing is more like that. So the benefit of ESR is basically, so ESR is meant to be combined with static site generation or server-side rendering. And reason why I was such a stickler on the whole re-rendering is because that actually is what it is. You your app does get like, so whatever it is that you override, there is an original render of whatever that was. So if it's
Okay.
like a hero, like if it's a banner hero or something, whatever the default one your app would render in literally gets rendered is like, you know, your static site generation or your server side rendering with caching, like if you're doing remix or something like that.
Yeah.
And then we can cache that HTML and then just re-render just the minimum amount of code. Now, we don't know ahead of time, like when you build your app, we don't know which component, like we don't know which props you're going to pick to override and all that stuff. So we have to statically analyze all of it and extract out the necessary metadata. And then based on the override, because you can change the override separate from your deployment of your app. You can basically say, I want to override this component. Now I want to override this component. And
So that override could be driven by your CMS. That could
yes,
be without rebuilding. You're redynamicizing your
data can come from CMS, and then you could use stale while we validate with your data, or it could be embedded, or it could come from anything. You know, it really depends on what dynamic content you're doing. Ideally, you don't leave the edge because you'll get the best performance if you don't actually leave the box. And so when you do need to leave the edge, it's best to do some sort of caching. So like stale while we validate or whatever, some sort of caching mechanism, or doing like push or something. Because if you have to leave, then whatever, if your API takes 130 milliseconds, you're going to slow your request down by 130 milliseconds.
So to summarize what you're saying there, like if we request comes in for index.html, when that hits the server, if the server has to make a full round trip to your CMS and back to get that information, you've already lost, right?
Yeah, I mean to a certain extent. I mean, like ironically, it probably, as long as your CMS is fast, it probably still would be faster than doing client side dynamic. Like this, the client side stuff, I cannot stress how slow it can be on these mobile devices.
It was almost 5 seconds in your demonstration, I think, right?
Yeah, and that was actually after doing some optimization so that it looked better. And then there are cases where it won't be as bad, and there are a much bigger long tail of cases that are way worse. At least in our experience, you know. The experience of the people we talked to.
In another talk, you were talking about like parsing the JavaScript actually takes a while, which I was like, I've always taken that for granted.
That's one of the biggest problems with mobile is these phones. If it's not an iPhones are fast as hell, but if it's not an iPhone, you know, if it's just these Moto G4s or whatever, JavaScript just kills you. It's so slow to parse and compile and start running that, and then to actually run it. That is your biggest kicker, is that it, even if you had to leave the edge and go and do an API call, it probably still is way faster than what you get. Because think of it this way, like if it takes 5 seconds to do it client side, but on your API, you have to, you know, on the edge using ESR, you have to make an API call that you can't cache, but the API call only takes 130 milliseconds. Then guess what? Now instead of 5 seconds, you're taking 140 seconds or milliseconds or whatever. Like, I mean, like it's still not as ideal, but it's still significantly faster than what the alternative would be. Really, the big things is like it's the problem with these topics is there's always nuance that is difficult to get in. Like certainly there's cases where you don't need an anti-flicker snippet and you don't need all these, it's below the fold. There's cases where client side's fine. We're not trying to kill client side in the sense of, I think client-side solutions will forever exist because there are cases. Like, first off, right off the bat, if you're not using React, we don't have a solution for you today. We're not trying to have a solution for you today. But so and you can't beat the simplicity of just tell your devs to add this script tag to the page, and then now your marketers can go in and ruin it. That is very simple and great. I know it's ruined. Like in a
I've been on the other side of those talks.
Right.
This is never that easy.
Yeah, but
I feel like one of my biggest challenges with my blog, I've got zachduros.dev that I've been working on, and I've been enjoying it. Like it's nice to have like a little control over like a project, right? But like I want to do cool stuff with it. Like I want to have like comments, I want to have claps, and like interesting. I want to experiment with interesting ways of like chatting or something like that. Like this really dynamic stuff going back and forth. But I also wanted to not suck on Lighthouse, And so it's like I was looking. So I'm being an Angular guy. I was looking into Scully, and Scully looks like really cool for this. So the idea there is like static site generation, but like a different way of doing it than the conventional way. Like essentially, they launched Puppeteer after you run a build, and they crawl your Angular app and figure out all the routes, and you can give it some ways of figuring out all the dynamic routes and stuff like that, and it'll kind of statically generate your site that way, which is pretty cool. But like trying to figure out how to get like a really nice tool set with all that, so you're serving easily, I can work on it easily, and still like develop these cool tools on it. It feels, I don't know, it feels like we're not there yet. I have the same exact thought every time I try to do something akin to an A/B test. I feel like there's not a good way of systematizing that. Same thing when we were talking about like accessibility. Yeah. It's a hard problem to solve, and I wish there was like, so it's just like, let's just figure this out, put that in a box, and we're done. you know? But yeah, some of these problems just elude that. It feels like. But anyways, yeah, figuring out that the combination of how do I get a good Lighthouse score, and still how can I do this cool stuff with JavaScript, and just like the biggest thing for me for JavaScript, I'm curious if you feel the same way too, Jay, is it feels so free. Like as soon as I went from working in IVRs, I was in Java, and working with Java, felt like such a chore. I was slugging through like trying to make a hash map from this array, and I don't even remember all the stuff I was doing. I just remember it being miserable. And then I come into JavaScript, it's like so free. There's something about just like object literals being that easy, and all the niceties that come around from that. Like it feels like I feel like a wizard. It's just a really fun like feeling to have compared to the others. But like figuring out how to still get that power while still, being really quick. Do you think there's anything about ESR that can help with that?
To a great extent, in the sense of like the whole benefit of these sorts of things is like it's difficult to how do I put this? So it's difficult to frameworks like Next and Gatsby and these sorts of things have been making it easier to get good performance if you're careful. I mean, you can certainly accidentally, you can not accidentally, but you can bring in like a plugin or something that then just tremendously slows things down. I mean, that's one of the big reasons that the Next.js folks have been pushing back on a plugin, on an official like robust plugin system, is because they've seen some of the issues that have come with Gatsby. Where in the sense of like someone, you'll write a plugin, and if you add that plugin, the engineer isn't always going to realize whether or not that plugin was written well, whether it does best practices, whether it impacts anything. And then, there's always death by a thousand cuts too. The more plugins you add, the more things just pile on. And then at some point, people end up just blaming Gatsby. It's like, it's Gatsby that's slow. And it's like,
Gatsby, we're having
know.
similar problems at NX at Normal now. It's like, we support third-party plugins, and that's cool and all, but eventually you start taking some responsibility for that if things start slowing down, or like you said, death by a thousand cuts. But sorry, go ahead.
No, it's good anecdotes. I hadn't heard that, but so the ideal is just that you would like, so ESR, edge slice re-rendering, it's not designed for like, this might be controversial to say, so take a step back of what I was to say. I think one of the problems with the web is that a lot of engineers they see an app and a site as being different things, and they want to feel like they're building an app. And so they bring in technologies and use technologies that are good for apps, but bad for like there's trade-offs, right? There's a trade-off you're making for an app, and an app is a different, like apps are like a great example of how do I say this? Applications, there's a reason why binaries on the App Store, like on iOS and Android and stuff like that, are massive, and most people don't really care. It's not a commonly complained thing, and the reason why is because you're not downloading the app all the time. You're downloading it once, right? And there's this initial
how awesome would that be?
There's this cost that you pay, and then you're going to use that app frequently, right?
So who cares?
Yeah, I mean, ideally you want to make it faster, but still, people are more willing to invest in that initial loading period if it's going to be continuously pay dividends. If Google Docs, if loading Google Docs for the very first time took 10 seconds, people would still do it. Like, because, but I'm saying it doesn't, as long as it doesn't take 10 seconds every time you load the damn thing, like people would still do it because you pay that cost and then you're able to pay dividends. Now, if you're building a store, an e-commerce store, or anything similar to that, anything you might use, Shopify, Contentful, these sorts of Jamstack type of things, in my mind, you can call it an app if you want. I'm not trying to gatekeep. I'm just saying that I think the technologies that are ideal for these these apps that you download it and then you're going to live your life in it for quite a while. I think the technologies for that and the technologies for these e-commerce things have different trade-offs and should be different. And so what we've kind of done is shoehorn the app ones into the site ones. And this is the controversial opinion, is that, and it's because I feel like, and I've been there. For the longest time, I didn't want to say, like, whenever I would work on a site, I would still say an app because I feel like an engineer, those sorts of things. And it's like, I don't think it's any less. I think that's I can relate to the distinction, but I've by and large for myself at least gotten over it in the sense of I think that they should have different trade-offs, different technologies, because they have different goals. Like the average store, you're optimizing for almost always, but not always, but almost always, you're optimizing for one thing: inbound from ads or SEO to be as fast as possible, so that the person doesn't bounce, because chances are they have no idea what your brand is, or maybe they do know your brand, but they've never visited your website. Like that's. For a huge majority of them, it's like you got one shot. It's got to be fast, and if they'll just bounce. Anyway, that was a long setup.
Sorry. Go ahead. You're setting something up.
Yeah, so it's a long setup for me to say that I think ESR is the goal of ESR is to more solve the site use case, not the app use case. If you're building the next Google Docs, I don't see edge slice rendering being something that you would want to use. Static site generation is also not something you'd want to use. It doesn't make any sense. So that's where ESR really shines, though, is in these cases of more like the sites sort of thing, where it's like by and large most of your page is typically some sort of cacheable thing, but there are pieces of it that you want to be dynamic, whether it be for personalization, A/B testing, localization, pricing, whatever. And that's very different than like a dashboard for deploying your Vercel app or for Google Docs or Twitter. Like those sorts of things they're more appy, more like, you download this thing and then now you almost become someone who can, like, how many people are like, there are certainly crossovers. I think like Etsy is an example of something that's like, it's a store, but yet people still there are a lot of people who kind of live in it, in the sense of like, there are a lot of people who don't even know what Etsy is. They go and they buy something from Etsy. But there are also a class of people who are like obsessed with Etsy and like buy everything they possibly can from Etsy, and they're just like, all into it and stuff like that. So there are my generalization doesn't work for everything, but a lot of times people don't associate themselves with these sites. They're not like, oh, I'm a Zappos person or whatever, or I'm a whatever, Zappos.com or whatever. Like they're like, it's a means to an end. The brand, they might associate themselves with the brand, but not, just like how I associate myself with Twitter, but I don't associate Twitter as the website, but I don't associate myself with Twitter the brand. Like it's like the opposite. Like I have no association with the Twitter brand. Like I'm saying, for my feeling, like I don't feel associated with them at all.
Yeah.
But Twitter.com is definitely part of my identity, like, for better or worse. Like I'm on it so much, but when I go and I buy things, it's more transactional. Anyway, I'm kind of speaking in circles, but that was the distinction I wanted to make, is that it's ESR is an additive thing to make to circle back to your original question about like, how can it make those things easier? The ideal would be that like you build your site with something you build your store or what have you with something like a Gatsby or a Next, and do as much as you can with static site generation or with heavy caching. Either is essentially the same, and then everything else for the dynamic stuff, you have this nice, clean, separate place where you can do, you can have custom weird business logic. I feel like it's a really good separation of concerns when it comes to those sorts of things, because it's like, the business logic of these dynamic things they're a lot of times they're temporary and ever evolving, where it's like this week we're going to do this new personalization, or we're going to run this new A/B test, or we're going to, whatever it is.
Well, if you don't mind me saying so, it seems like there's potential in this for A/B tests, like my A/B test problem of, well, how do I implement this properly to be solved? Like I could ship code that goes out there and specify. I'm still a bit fuzzy on the details here, but specifies this is a dynamic piece, so I'll just ship it out with some default values. My A/B test can then just become part of my CMS. Like I don't need to know about that as I'm developing this.
No.
That's part of my delivery system, which seems the answer to me. I don't know.
Yeah, and there's exceptions to that. I mean, like, so there's like, if I'm being transparent and frank, like there's benefits to us. Everything's based on props, right? So props to these components. And so there's benefits to that, as in like, you didn't need to change your app and you got this natural delineation and we got all this stuff for free. But there's also negatives, like it's sometimes hard to find a demarcation line, like a place in your app where you're like, this is a clean place to override this particular prop that will change this particular thing. And we have, we're a very new startup. We're just coming out of stealth mode. So a lot of these questions we have potential solutions for. We just have not created something to solve for it. But like, we don't have the answer for the person who wants like marketing department to be able to go to the website in a WYSIWYG and drag a button completely over to here, or like, just completely be like, I'm going to screw up your website and move things around.
A/B tests.
maybe just, yeah. I mean, who knows whether that's actually a good thing or whether it's just giving someone a gun to shoot themselves with. But we have answers for those. They're just not supported currently. But that's, there are limitations, just like everything else. There's limitations, and there's use cases this is great for, and there's use cases where it's not as ideal for. So you got to trade, and we'll evolve and get better and expand our use cases, just like other solutions will as well.
Yeah. Well, the whole metaphor of the carousel was, where we kind of go around in circles. But each time we go around the circle, it feels like the tooling gets that much better. The environments get that much better. So,
but the requirements get harder.
Yeah.
Expectations. I mean, like the expectations, in my opinion, get tremendously harder. I mean, like, because like one of the first like true, like, I don't know, like I've seen the evolution of like the apps that were getting built in the late, like in like 2008, 2010, like that's like the big point where apps started becoming appy. Like Gmail was one of the first, like apps. And then even that, like there was still a couple year gap where other people were kind of playing catch up on technology. Like, how do I do something more like that?
Yeah.
And it's just the requirements of what is the expectations of things have just gotten much, much higher, in my opinion. Not in a bad way. I just mean that like, you raise the bar. Sites do this and that and the other thing, and you just got to get higher and higher and higher. So, but it can feel like you're not making progress. This is the reason why I bring up the bar raising. Is it can feel to some people, I've commonly heard people say, and I've felt this myself, is that it feels like you went back around but haven't actually made any progress. And it's not. Yeah. If you really think about it, for me at least, it's just because the requirements have gotten so much harder.
Our tooling has risen, our developer skill has risen, but along with that, the requirements of us have gone up just as much. Right. So, yeah, kind of like the American workforce. Right. Is that the thing? Like, I think in the 1950s or I think it was before this actually. Ford was talking about like, oh man, by the year 2000, people will be working like 3 hours a week.
Right.
And that didn't happen.
No. The other examples of like there's the printer example or analogy, I guess. Like, so in the sense of like blogs, like we've had blogs since almost the beginning of the internet, and it really hasn't gotten that much easier to write. Markdown has been a huge thing, right?
Yeah,
that's a huge boon for it. But they're still not particularly faster. They're still not like it seems like by now we should have solved blogs. Like blogs should have been solved, where it's like there's no excuse to be fast and no excuse. Like, but yeah. It's not a solved problem. So that is an example to your point of the bar hasn't really risen on blogs, but we still, and that's why I was making the analogy to printers, is that the bar hasn't really risen that high on a printer, but it's still like, I still have a printer literally sitting under the desk that's a paperweight now because the damn thing just doesn't work.
I'm looking at mine over there in disgust. It still works, but it's very finicky. It's like, and it won't work with my Mac, so I have this weird like chain of slacking it from my Mac to my phone so I can print it, which seems like such a weird thing. It's like the exact opposite of what I feel like I used to do. But yeah, technology. How are you doing on time, Jay? Do you want to keep talking?
I do need to wrap up. Yeah.
Okay, let's do that. Jay, thank you so much for coming over. It was so cool to talk about your, edge slice rerendering, Outsmartly, RxJS a little bit, bunch of other cool stuff. Thank you so much for everything you do for the community and your talks and all that stuff. Really cool to see all the content you had out there on the internet for free. So thank you so much, sir, and thank you so much for.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, and I just wanted to. I can't go on these things without saying, but if you are interested in edge slice rerendering, we are just coming out of stealth, but we already have enterprises in production today. But if you're interested in even just playing with it for free, like, or whatever, just add yourself to the wait list, outsmartly.com/signup. And we have a little field where you can explain your use case and those sorts of things. And we've been prioritizing based on the people who have interesting use cases, but even if you don't have a use case and you're just like, I just want to play, just say that. And we might throw you a token, throw you a key, and you can just play around and stuff. Because we're at the phase right now where it's like we're in production with a bunch of people, and now we're trying to basically just figure out like what's the best approach to get this to everyone. So
Yeah. I just filled out that same form. Like 3 minutes before we started talking, but I'll make sure I put that down in the comments below too. So, cool. Jay, you're awesome, man. Thanks so much. I want to give a shout out to your flamethrower behind you too, because that's so cool.
My boring flamethrower, my dragon dagger, and then the lightsaber and Baby Yoda. Hold on, let me go get Baby Yoda.
Wait, is that a green Power Ranger? Oh.
All right. You want to say hi? He looks very happy. Grogu.
Oh. So the dragon saber, Jay, is that Green Power Ranger dragon saber?
It is, yes, exactly. Okay. From the original. It makes the sound and everything. Does all the fun stuff. Yeah.
I always wanted one of those when I was a kid.
Oh, you can still buy them. Yeah, they're cheap too. They're not expensive. Yeah.
I'll have to go find it. I'll put a link in the comments. Awesome. Well, Jay, again, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for coming by. We'll see you next week. Bye.